Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Yuval Levin, who is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founding and current editor of National Affairs, he is also the senior editor of The New Atlantis and a contributing editor to National Review. Yuval Levin, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yuval, the conversation I'd like to have with you today is about the U.S. Constitution and institutions. And before we jump into that, I just want to remind our audience that the Cognitive Crucible, it's not a political podcast. We talk about information operations and cognitive security matters which affect national security. That said, it's difficult to talk about some of these things without brushing up against current events or emotionally charged subject matter. So my goal here is to start this conversation by hopefully letting the air out of that balloon just a little bit. And as a bit of a sidebar, one of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. And Yuval, you've been a guest on Econ Talk.
Yeah, it's really the best.
Yeah, a couple of times. It's also one of the I don't know if this is the older podcast. It's been around since like 2006. Right. Anyway, heartily recommend that podcast. But anyway, one time the podcast host Russ Roberts, he did something kind of cool that I want to try to emulate. So economics is one of those disciplines where there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of different opinions on different economic schools of thought and how economies should be managed at the micro level, macro level, et cetera. So one of the things that Russ did once upon a time was he tried to articulate, it was something like 4 or 5 different economic principles or economic ideas which most serious economists would agree with, no matter what their school of thought. And I don't remember what they all were, but one of them was like the effect of the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. If you ask 100 economists of different schools of thought, what's the effect of minimum wage on the economy? Most of them would have, would agree that it tends to, depress employers' desire to hire people. Most people would agree with that. Right. So anyway, that's kind of how I want to start this conversation out and kind of baseline some things around the Constitution and institutions. Like ask you, what are the kinds of things that people tend to agree with? Does that sound like a reasonable way to step into this? All right. Well, let's do it. So the U.S. Constitution. You're a constitutional scholar. So this is a document that gets debated passionately. We're recording this, by the way, on December 3rd. So there are some constitutional issues in our public discourse right now, which people are very passionate about, the whole Roe versus Wade type stuff. Mm-hmm. Referencing back to the Econ Talk initiative there, what are the kinds of things that serious constitutional scholars tend to agree with about the Constitution?
It's a great question because actually there's a huge amount of agreement about the Constitution, even though when we think about it, we mostly think about disagreements. And I think that's because the disagreements that happen at the margins are elevated and magnified because they have to be resolved. And oftentimes they have to be resolved in court. Sometimes they have to be resolved in political debates. And that means that most of the time when we talk about the Constitution, we talk about what we disagree about. But underlying that, there is very broad agreement, first of all, about the nature of the Constitution as a framework. The Constitution is the framework for our governing institutions. It's the law of the land everywhere it applies. These things were all controversial to begin with, but they're not controversial now. A lot of it is quite straightforward. It establishes the shape and structure of the institutions, modes of election to office. All of these things are extremely important. They can easily become controversial in many other democracies, but because of the nature and clarity of our Constitution, they're not particularly controversial here. There are even some things that used to be very controversial questions of interpretation that now are quite broadly agreed on. Like, for example, the notion that the Bill of Rights applies to the states and not just the federal government, so that when it says Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of religion, that also means that the state legislature of Nebraska can't abridge the freedom of religion. That was a very controversial view in the 19th century, and it is now an absolutely universal view among people who think about the Constitution, whether they're judges, whether they're scholars. We've come to understand the document in that way. And I would say that that's an example of the way that interpretation and application can create agreement over time. The Constitution has to be applied to different circumstances, and that's why differences emerge about it, right? We know what the words say on the page, but when you actually try to apply them in the real world, things get very, very complicated. And yet, I think over time, there do emerge some general sense of what does the freedom of speech mean? What does the freedom of religion mean? What is the what's the definition of Congress's powers in Article 1 actually apply to? A lot of these things now are fairly broadly agreed on, but we find ourselves spending most of our time talking about those places where we disagree. Some of those are very specific. The Supreme Court a couple years ago had to answer the question of whether the freedom of speech in the First Amendment means that anti-war activists can protest outside a soldier's funeral and call him a murderer, right? And it seems on the one hand obvious that that's something that the community should just not allow to happen when his family is mourning him. On the other hand, the Constitution says the freedom of speech can't be abridged. And the Supreme Court debated that question, determined 8-1 that those protesters did have a right to be there, but it was 8-1. There was, someone who made it all the way to the Supreme Court thought that actually, no, that's not what the First Amendment means. And that's the kind of question that over time comes to be resolved in a particular way. And so, again, I would say, generally speaking, our constitutional practice is rooted in very broad agreement, but most of what we talk and think about is about those places at the margins where there are intense disagreements about what it means.
Right. I guess that's fighting between the 40-yard lines.
Exactly. So we're lucky that that's where we fight. That's one of the strengths of our Constitution.
Yeah. Well, that was the next item I wanted to ask you to talk about is what do you think the major strengths of the Constitution are? And then I'll also ask you about what you think some of the weaknesses might be.
Well, I would say the greatest strength of our Constitution in particular is that it seeks and it often finds a balance between empowering majorities, which is what a democracy has to do, and protecting minorities. In that regard, there's really nothing like our Constitution in the world. It is rooted in a very clear understanding of the danger of majority power, and yet also in the sense that only majority power can be legitimate political power. And so what do you do? And it turns out that one thing you can do is create overlapping majorities, institutions that are elected in different ways, all of which are democratic, and can fight each other a little bit in ways that restrain the excesses of democracy. So the Senate is elected in one way at the state level now. It used to be the Senate was selected by state legislators. Mm-hmm. The House is elected very directly. The president is elected rather indirectly. And the same country, the same electorate, can make somewhat different decisions when it's broken down in these different ways. And of course, we also have other overlapping majorities at the state level, at the local level. Our Constitution sets up a system in which there's just an enormous number of elections. We don't really think about this in America, but a lot of democracies, you have one big election every few years. In the United States, there are always election signs where I live because there's always an election coming up. It might be just for mayor, it might be for governor, it might be for president, it might be for Congress, but we are always providing that kind of feedback to our system. And there are also some important counter-majoritarian elements to the system, like the courts, which are not directly elected and where judges have lifetime appointments so that they don't have to worry about public opinion. The nature of the Senate, which is not simply majoritarian. And so the idea behind all these is to find some way to establish a government that is democratically legitimate and yet doesn't allow majorities to step over minorities. And our Constitution is extremely good at doing that. I think its greatest strength is the capacity it has to do that. And then, that's rooted itself in another strength of our Constitution, which I think is that I would describe it as taking human nature very seriously. It doesn't trust anybody. The Constitution does not trust leaders. It does not trust elites. It also does not trust the public and wants to check everybody against everybody else. Nobody has unchecked power. Even Congress, in making laws, is ultimately checked by a president who has a veto power, by courts who can overrule them. And everybody, when you think about it, everybody has a core job in the system, but also has to answer to somebody else and be checked by somebody else when it goes too far. And I think that is rooted in a sense of the importance of social peace, of resolving differences without their becoming violent, that is the source of some extraordinary strengths of our system.
Yeah, fantastic, Yuval. That really paints that picture vividly and elegantly. So could you talk about what you perceive might be some of the weaknesses in the U.S. Constitution?
Yeah, some of the weaknesses are very related to these strengths, which is the Constitution is very complicated. It's complicated on purpose so that, again, nobody just has power that's unchecked. But what it means is that it's very hard to get things done. And when people feel like, well, there was an election and my guy won, and now we should just be able to get what we want, which is how a lot of democracies work. Perfectly legitimate democracies in Europe, for example, elect a parliament, and then the majority party in that parliament can just basically do anything it wants until the public throws it out. That is not how the US system works. It's not how Congress works. It's not how our system as a whole works. And it can lead to a lot of frustration where people think, well, what's the point? We never get anything done. There are also weaknesses that have to do with the rigidity of the system and with the vagueness of the Constitution, which I think are just a function of our having a written Constitution. A written Constitution can be very good because it establishes the rules pretty clearly and it gives you something distinct to argue about. But it's hard to change as circumstances change. And, in modern life, circumstances change. And there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution, but that's happened over a period of more than 2 centuries now. And it's not much. And we often find ourselves thinking, well, I don't know, that's a way of doing things that doesn't really make sense now. And at the same time, there are also ways that the Constitution, because it's written down, can be vague in its application, right? We have a prohibition in the Bill of Rights on cruel and unusual punishment. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the death penalty? And we have a long, 200 years of argument about whether the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. People make historical arguments, people make philosophical arguments, scientific arguments, and a lot of our most intense and enduring debates have to do with the vagueness of the Constitution, which is unavoidable in a written document like that. You can't cover every possible instance. Does the right to privacy mean that the police can't use a scanner that can see through the walls of your home, thermal scanner? Well, who knows? I mean, certainly the framers of the Constitution didn't have an opinion about that. They couldn't have imagined that. And so how are we supposed to think about it? That's another question that went all the way to the Supreme Court. So I think in some ways, the weaknesses of our Constitution are functions of the same thing as its strengths, which is that it's not too simple and that it's written down. And so, I think those are prices that are worth it for what we get for our Constitution, but they do create a lot of controversy and a lot of frustration.
And presumably it also creates public discourse or conversations within Congress and our government, which are, for the most part, open and transparent so that the public can observe and participate in the conversation as well, which is a healthy thing.
That's right. We end up arguing about the Constitution quite a bit. A lot of debates that in a lot of other countries become very fundamental debates about basic goods, in America, take the form of debates about the Constitution. So we argue about whether the Constitution, permits the practice of abortion. And in a funny way, we end up not arguing as much about abortion that way. We end up arguing instead about the nature of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And that's the case with a lot of issues we face. And, I think it's mostly a good thing. It means that we end up talking about our system of government a lot, and also that we avoid the most divisive possible forms of the kinds of arguments we have. But, it requires a lot of knowledge of the Constitution. It requires a sense that we, every American who's involved in politics has to be a little bit of a lawyer, and kind of always be thinking about, what are judges going to say about this? Yeah. What does Article 2 say? It's a funny thing about our country. Our identity is so tied up with the Constitution that there is a kind of lawyerliness to our politics.
Yeah, great, Yuval. This leads me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. So I can imagine that back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the members of Congress back then probably had a familiarity with the Constitution that is not present today, because they were, a lot of them were alive when it was created. But I'm curious, if you could somehow compare congressional representatives from the 1950s to the 1970s to today, do you think that today's members of Congress have the same level of constitutional knowledge compared to previous cohorts? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, there are a few things to be said. First of all, certainly it's true that in the early Congresses, the debates about the Constitution were very bizarre, because you'd have James Madison as a member of the House from Virginia saying, well, actually, no, that's not what we meant. And he was there, and, he wrote it. And so that carried a certain kind of weight. There were certainly intense constitutional debates in those days. Creating a national bank, for example, which is not conceived of in the Constitution, led to a debate about whether this was constitutional. And you had Alexander Hamilton and James Madison disagreeing about it, even though they were both there and were authors of the document. I would say, though, that the challenge of knowing the Constitution well is actually objectively a bigger challenge now than it was then, because knowing the Constitution doesn't just mean having read the text, which is just, it's 3 or 4 pages. If you publish it in a book, there's not much to it. It also means knowing the history of the development of these ideas, the jurisprudence around them, the boundaries that the Supreme Court has set up around various things. And that means that over time, there's actually more to know than there used to be. And really, to your question in particular, I would say that there has been a change in members of Congress. I wouldn't overstate how great members of Congress ever were. I think at any point, there's a wonderful passage in Democracy in America where Alexis de Tocqueville, a French visitor to the United States in the 1830s, spends a little time watching a debate from the gallery of the House of Representatives, and he's just shocked at how, simple-minded and ridiculous it is. And we shouldn't imagine that Congress used to be this kind of hall of giants. Maybe there were times when the Senate was like that, but generally it hasn't been. But one thing that has changed is that a lot more members used to be lawyers. And I do think that in that sense, there was more engagement with constitutional questions in debates, particularly in the House. A lot of senators are still lawyers now, but in the House, that has declined quite a bit. It's still the case that lawyer is the single largest group of professional. If you divide the House into professions, that's still what more members are than anything else, but far fewer than there used to be. A lot of members also used to be former members of state legislatures, which also is no longer the case. And in that sense, there is less constitutional knowledge. And not just knowledge, there's less of an inclination to think about the Constitution when thinking about the work they're doing. And Congress now, in a lot of ways, Congress is just more performative than it used to be. It thinks of itself as being on television, in part because it is on television, in ways that didn't used to influence those debates. And that means that a lot of the arguments that happen are kind of rehearsals of public debates of the moment. They sound like what you'd hear on cable news that day, that week.
Mm-hmm.
And there's less debate about broad constitutional questions. Not that it doesn't ever happen, but there's less of it. Now, Congress gets advice from serious people. It can draw on a lot of expertise, both within its own staff and from the outside. And so when members need advice on constitutional questions, they can certainly get it. But I would say there surely is less knowledge of the Constitution. And I think in some ways it is reflected in a sense of confusion among members of Congress at this point about their own role in the system.
Right.
Congress.
Yeah, I was wanting to ask you about that. I mean, do you consider members of Congress in a way to be like stewards of the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Congress is the central institution that the Constitution sets up. You might say Congress sets the direction of the whole system. The president has a very important job, but the core of his job is to execute the laws that Congress passes. The courts have a very important job, but the core of that job is to interpret the laws that Congress passes. Congress really is at the center. It has much more power than the other institutions. It can impeach the president and impeach judges. The president can't fire members of Congress, neither can judges. Congress is taken to be the kind of steward of the larger system because it is most answerable to the people. It's the most democratically accountable of our institutions. And I think we've gotten to a place now where a lot of members have adopted implicitly a president-centered understanding of our political system in both parties. And they see themselves more as observers, maybe as overseers of presidential activity than as the driving engine of our system of government. And there is just less legislating happening. There's less of a sense that Congress is really where the system happens among members. And I do think that that's something that needs to change if we're going to see a recovery, a rebalancing of our constitutional system. The weakest institution now, the most troubled one, without question, is Congress. Congress is intended to enable accommodation and compromise and bargaining. And I don't think a lot of members are interested in that at this point. And that means that the institution really isn't functioning very well.
Okay, great perspective there. I'd like to turn to institutions now, if we may, Yuval, and ask the same kinds of questions. So first of all, is there a field of scholarship on institutions, and are there serious-minded scholars of a whole range of outlooks that tend to agree on a couple of core principles when it comes to institutions?
Well, so there's not a specialized field for studying institutions, but I think in some ways that's because everybody in the social sciences has to study institutions. The concept of the institution is so broad and capacious that it's a really important part of what a lot of scholars do. Institutions are absolutely key to sociology, to political science, to economics, to anthropology, and more than that. And so they really couldn't fit into one field. But part of what that means is that people in these different disciplines think about institutions differently. I'm a political scientist, and political science thinks a lot about institutions. But I would say we tend to think about them in terms of organizational structure and the creation of incentives for behavior. When sociologists think about institutions, they tend to think about them in terms of the formation of norms. When economists think about institutions, they tend to think about them actually as arrangements of rules. I think all these things are true, but that means that it's very hard to arrive at a broad kind of what the social scientists mean by institutions. There's a wonderful book by a political scientist named Hugh Heclo called On Thinking Institutionally. And he actually tried systematically to go through the definitions of institution that you find in the different social sciences. And he stopped when he got to 57 definitions because he just thought this is absurd. And he includes them all in the book, but to make the point that there's not one, but that in a sense, what we mean by institutions, and this is the definition that I incline to also, what we mean by institutions are really the forms of common action. They're kind of the shapes and structures of what we do together. So it's true that some institutions are organizations, like a university, a company, a civic association, a school, but that's not all. A lot of institutions are not formally corporate in that sense. The family is the first and foremost institution of any society. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself, what holds these different things together? And ultimately, institutions are the way in which people act in common. So that an institution is not just a bunch of people, it's a bunch of people organized around a common purpose and given a role individually by that purpose, so that in relation to the common goal, everybody has a particular role. And that means that they also have a role in relation to each other. That's what institutions do for us. They give us a place, a connection, a relation to other people. And that means that really is a very foundational concept of all the social sciences.
It sounds to me like institutions and institutional influence has vertical and horizontal integration throughout the world, really. But if we just stick to the United States, the same thing applies there. And it's interesting that you observe the family itself as an institution. So you've said, like, okay, so the family, education, it would be considered an institution. Congress, could that be considered an
Absolutely.
institution?
Congress is certainly an institution. And again, it has a role, a clear purpose. And in pursuit of that goal, it defines roles for individuals within it. So every member has a purpose that relates to the purpose of the whole institution, but also has a particular role. Maybe this member is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and that member is the Speaker of the House, and that member is a backbencher in her first term. And those particular roles place them in relation to each other and in relation to the overall purpose of the institution. And I think that's what an institution ultimately does for us. It means that we're not just isolated individuals, but that we can be groups of people working together toward a common end. And so obviously institutions are absolutely essential because they're the only way that we can do anything together. And that means that, the family, for example, there is a distinct role for a parent and a child and a grandparent and an uncle. And yet there's also a way to understand what they all are together. And I think that's really characteristic of an institution. Well, one other thing I'd say is that because they are forms of common action, institutions are also formative. They shape the people inside them. And that's an absolutely essential thing to understand about every functional institution, is that it shapes the people in it to have a certain kind of character, so that you say, I'm a Marine, right? And that means that I'm a certain kind of human being in the world. There's a certain kind of human being that's called a member of Congress, right? And a certain kind of human being that's called a physician or an accountant. Those people are defined by an understanding, by a mode of integrity that says, this is what I do and this is what I don't do. And that definition comes from the institution. And so it's really crucial to understand that institutions shape us. They form human beings. They shape our character. They shape our soul precisely by shaping our relation to the rest of the world.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Are there new institutions emerging? Do institutions come and go? I don't want to lead the question too much. Social networks are not new. They've been around for thousands of years, but do new technological developments somehow catalyze the formation of new things? Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Absolutely, there? Yeah. I mean, because an institution serves a purpose, right? It's a way for people to work together toward a common goal. The fact that there are always new goals emerging or new tools emerging or new things we could do together means that there are always new institutions emerging. And there are also always old institutions falling away. That happens less, I would say. Institutions on the whole are durable. That's part of what defines them. But as new possibilities emerge, they take the form of new institutions. So without question, we've seen the emergence of a lot of new institutions in the 21st century. Social media, as you say, is something that just didn't exist 20 years ago, and now is hugely important to the ways in which we live. And I think one of the ways to understand what it is through the lens of institutions, which would lead us to ask, how does it shape us? How does it shape our relationships to each other? What kind of roles does it have in relation to other institutions? It's a way to help us understand really what it is and what it does. And there's no doubt that we're always forming new institutions, and much of the time also seeing old ones fall away as their purposes fall away, as their goals become less significant to us.
Do you have any, does an example come to mind of an institution that is atrophying or that has fallen away?
Well, a lot of times, for example, when we think about some of the challenges we face in American social life, we say things like people are less involved now in things like the Rotary and civic institutions. And that's true. But we have to understand that that's not just something that's happened to us. That's a set of decisions that we've made, so that maybe the way we live now means that something like the Rotary just has less of a role to play than it used to. A lot of times when institutions fall away, it's because their purposes become less important to us. One of the kind of core premises of sociology is that people don't come together to be together. People come together to do something together. And that means that if all you offer is just a way to meet up, then that institution is probably not going to survive. Ultimately, what draws people in is the ability, the opportunity to do something, to make some change in the world together. And so as various modes of advancing change fall away, and you can see that in American civil society, you would find that institutions fall away too. The question is whether new ones emerge to take their place. And that's the challenge we face now in American civic life.
Right. I was thinking of something like the post office. I'm not sure whether the post office, I mean, that kind of seems almost like it's a government function. But I suppose you could say, oh, sure, call that an institution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an institution.
It's changed, yeah.
And if it doesn't find new purposes, then it will absolutely fall away, right? I mean, we don't have a big industry of people making carriages to be pulled around by horses anymore, because we just have a different way of getting around. And as that kind of change happens, whether it's economic or cultural or political, the institutions that enabled an old way of life certainly fall away as a new one replaces it.
Right. I guess one could also look at the post office as a capability of disseminating information, and there's new capabilities that have subsumed it, or that do the same thing. And so I suppose institutions morph as well, and my probably incorrect words, the inhabitants of the institution, the employees and the leaders, and change, but the function still exists in society.
That's right. And some institutions can adapt. The post office used to mostly deliver letters, and in the age of the internet, just carrying information around from door to door is not as appealing. But now the post office mostly delivers boxes. It's become a logistics agency that moves packages around. And that's a way of trying to adapt to changing needs and changing circumstances. And if you can't do that, then you do fall away.
Right. You talked about the way people interact with institutions. I wanted to kind of ask about that in maybe a little bit of a different way. And I mentioned it just a moment ago, but I think of people inhabiting institutions as the leaders and the employees of, say, colleges or the post office or Congress. But then there's the people who interact with the institution, either as customers or students, or anyway. But my question is, as you gaze across institutions, do the inhabitants of institutions tend to be homogenous, or do they tend to be heterogeneous, or do some institutions have more homogeneity and others less? Do you kind of get what I'm asking there?
I would say because institutions at their best are formative, they can tend to create homogeneity. They take diverse people and make them more alike by making them all into soldiers or doctors or Harvard graduates. And because that is a human type, in a sense, people who are properly formed by institutions like that become more like one another and become more identifiable by the traits that those institutions give them. And sometimes those are what we would call the inhabitants of the institution, the people who run it, the people who populate it. But sometimes they are more like the customers of it, right? The students at Harvard are not themselves exactly the inhabitants of the institution. The faculty defines the institution, but the students are formed by it in a powerful way. They're shaped by it. And I think that's true in almost any significant institution. And so institutions do tend to strive toward the creation of a certain kind of homogeneity. But one way in which you see institutions weakening in our own time is that they can come to serve more as platforms for individual expression than as molds of character and behavior that way. And so when the inhabitants of institutions think of those institutions as platforms for themselves, the institution becomes less effective in shaping them. You see that in Congress too, for example. A lot of members of Congress now engage with the institution as a platform for performance. They see it as a way to get a bigger following on social media, a better time slot on cable news. They're not really being shaped into legislators. They're standing on Congress to be noticed in the larger culture. I think you see that now in a lot of places, including in universities, that see themselves as arenas for expression more than for formation. You see it in some parts of corporate America where, a company that has a particular purpose instead comes to be used as a platform for cultural expression, for political expression. But I think a functional institution creates a kind of internal homogeneity. A less functional one might operate more as a kind of cultural platform.
Right. I've heard you talk about this in another forum, and also like having cameras in Congress, right, or cameras in the Supreme Court too.
Yeah, I mean that becomes a kind of it turns that institution into a platform, into a place to perform. And fortunately, we don't have cameras in the Supreme Court, and I hope we never do. There's audio mistake. Of oral arguments, but the court has been very resistant to cameras. It's up to them. There are some courts that have cameras, including some federal courts, but the Supreme Court has always resisted that, and I think with very good reason, because it tends to turn everything that happens into a TV show. And what happens in court has a different kind of purpose than that.
Right. One of the themes on this podcast, I like talking about cybernetics. Are you familiar with what cybernetics is?
A bit, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's second order cybernetics, which takes cybernetics and adds to it. But my definition of second order cybernetics is there's like an observer effect. And if so you've got these feedback loops that are happening where institutions are influencing people and people are influencing the institution back, and so on and so forth. But then when an ecosystem gets observed, it's the same thing in scientific and social study experiments. They have to be very carefully crafted so that the act of observing the subject matter doesn't taint the results, and it's very hard to do.
I think it's very true. There's a way that social media has this effect on all of us all the time, where we're experiencing something, whether it's good or bad in our lives, and our first thought or our second thought is, what's this going to look like on Facebook or on Instagram?
Exactly.
How should I frame this so that it looks right? When in fact, you're at your kid's graduation. I mean, just live it.
Just be there, right? Yeah. So if we rewind the clock back to the beginning of the 1700s again, I mean, there's a certain type of person who seeks political office in the first place. So those types of let's just call that steady state. that hasn't changed. So a politician from the early 1800s is, made out of the same cloth as somebody who's seeking office today. But what's different is that when congressional leaders would trump off to DC or Philadelphia to do their work, there wasn't the same kind of always on the availability to see what they're and hear what they're doing all the time. They would just go off for months at a time and come back and say, here's what we did. So that has an effect.
I think that's very true. And, it's particularly important in legislative work because legislative work is fundamentally negotiation. And negotiation is particularly undermined by an observer. It's very, very hard to negotiate in public, to make concessions, to put your priorities on the table is extremely difficult to do when all the interest groups are watching you, when every voter can watch you. That just has to happen in a private space somehow. And a lot of what's gone wrong in Congress, I think, the inability to bargain has a lot to do with the fact that there are very few spaces now where members can talk to each other in private. And, people complain all the work gets done in the leaders' offices at midnight before the government shutdown. But the reason for that is that's almost the only place in Capitol Hill where there's not a C-SPAN camera. And wherever that private space is, that's where the real work is going to happen. There's no way around it.
The Cognitive Crucible podcast is about cognitive security and operations in the information environment and how that can be productively managed today. And I wanted to have you into this forum to talk about the Constitution and institutions and how they interact. And could you conclude by just offering your observations on why it's important to bring these kinds of topics into the discussions about operations in the information environment?
Well, I think that when you think about the challenges of information and disinformation, the concept of trust is absolutely crucial. Disinformation flourishes where there is a shortage of trust. And that forces us to ask the question, how do you create trust? And I think the concept of the institution is absolutely central to answering that question. Institutions, when they're functioning well, are trust-producing machines. They give us a reason to believe people who make claims to authority. We can say, this person is telling me something and I should believe her because she is a scientist. That is a view, an assumption that takes a lot of work. I mean, it takes centuries of civilizational effort to get to a place where an average citizen might say, I'm going to trust this person because he's an expert. And the nature of the work that happens to make that possible is fundamentally institutional formation, enabling people to believe that the institutions that compose our society take their work seriously, place boundaries and restraints on the people within them, and therefore can be relied on so that when they do make an assertion or offer a command, we can believe that this has been through a process we can trust. I think that is really lacking now in American life. The response of a lot of people to every claim to authority is to say, well, who the hell are you? I'm not going to do what you say, and I'm not going to believe what you claim. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, people are right to have that skepticism. A lot of our institutions have fallen down on the job. And if we ask ourselves, how do we overcome this? How do we answer the challenge that, among other things, takes the form of effective disinformation? The answer to that has to be to somehow recapture the capacity of our institutions to engender trust. And so I think that's one reason why it's very important to ask ourselves, what are institutions? How do they work? What's their place in our cultural and political and social life? And it's why it's important for people in this space to connect with some of the social science and other work that happens around the question of institutions.
And with that, Yuval Levin, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, Visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.